The train put her down at a siding that wasn't quite a town yet. Just a grain elevator going up red against the sky, and a platform that ended in prairie. October in the Alberta foothills did what it always did out there. It pretended at warmth in the afternoon and took it all back by 4 o'clock. The conductor didn't help her with the trunk. She hadn't expected him to. She set it on the planks herself, sat on it, and waited, because the advertisement had said someone would come. She had read that advertisement maybe a dozen times by lamp oil she couldn't really spare. Homestead near the Porcupine Hills wants a steady hand. Woman preferred, work and keep, and a fair wage. Terms to be settled in person. She'd noticed that whoever wrote it had spelled settled carefully and crossed out something before it. You could tell from the smudge in the newspaper that he'd written and rewritten. A man who rewrote a 6-line advertisement was a man worried about being misunderstood, and a man worried about being misunderstood usually had something he was trying not to say. She had circled it with a pencil stub in a rooming house in Lethbridge where the landlady counted spoons. He came an hour late with a wagon and a single horse, and the first thing she did was look at the horse. It told her more than he would. A bay gelding, maybe 9, ribs you could read like a fence line, 1 forefoot he was favoring without quite limping. Hooves long overdue. The animal wasn't starving, but it was being kept by someone who had stopped paying attention to things. She knew the look. She had worn it herself for a while after the fire and had only climbed out of it because there had been nobody else to feed the stock, and the stock didn't care about your grief. The man got down stiff on one side, the left holding his shoulder like it was a thing he carried rather than a part of him. He was younger than the advertisement's tone. The tone had sounded like a settled older man, careful and slow. This one wasn't past 35. He looked at her trunk and at the long flat case beside it, the one with the brass clasps gone green, and he didn't ask what was in it. She liked that and distrusted it at the same time. "You're the one wrote," she said. Not a question. He said he supposed he was. He said the place was an hour out, more if the Ford was up, and that the wind would be at their backs going home, which was the only mercy the country offered for free. She climbed up before he could decide whether to offer a hand he plainly couldn't lift. She faced front, watched the horse's ears, and let the silence sit between them like a third passenger. The land changed as they drove. The flat broke into long grass coulees and the dark fur of poplar bluffs in the draws where water collected. Chinook Arch hung over the mountains to the west, that long bar of cloud with clear gold sky beneath it, and she knew from the feel on her face that the temperature would jump tonight. The snow on the high ground going to slush by morning. She counted things because counting was how she kept from hoping. 11 head of cattle on the home quarter where the grass said it could carry 20. A slough half-fenced, a wire gate mended with rope in 3 places, which meant a man who had run out of wire and out of the energy to go get more. The house was the second thing she looked at hard. Log and sod-roofed, 2 rooms by the chimney count, with a frame addition on the south side that someone had begun and then simply walked away from. The studs stood open to the weather, silvered now, and one wall had a window frame with no glass, just a square of October sky where a room was supposed to be. A garden plot had been turned once that spring and never planted. She could see the dead furrows, and up the rise behind the house, where the wind kept the grass short, there were 2 grave markers. Not 1, 2. One older, leaning. One newer, the wood still pale at the edges. She did not ask about the graves. People told you those things when they were ready, or they never told you. And either way, the asking only made it worse. There was a dog, a black and white thing with one ear up, who came out low and wary, and then decided she was acceptable on grounds she didn't understand and never questioned. The dog she trusted faster than the man. Dogs lived in the present tense. They couldn't lie about what they were waiting for. He carried her trunk in with his good arm and made 2 trips of it where one would have done for a whole man, and she let him, because a man who lets you see his weakness on the first day is either honest or a fool, and she hadn't decided which yet. Inside smelled of cold ash and bachelor, bacon grease and unwashed wool, and the particular sourness of a stove gone out too many mornings. 1 main room, a box stove on the north wall, dead, a plank table with 2 chairs. She noticed there were 2, and she noticed there were 2 of everything that should have been 1 for a man alone. 2 tin plates set on the shelf, 2 cups, Set the way you set them when you keep doing it. Out of a habit your hands won't break. A bunk in the corner with the blanket pulled square and tight. The one thing in the room that had been cared for. A shelf with a Bible and a tin of tea and a fiddle in a case with the latch hanging open, the strings slack, the rosin gone gray. She set her own case on the floor by the door. He looked at it. Farrier's tools, she said, answering the question he hadn't asked. And some doctoring. Horses, mostly. Cattle when I have to. Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly. More like a man recognizing a card he'd been hoping to draw and not quite believing it had come. That bay's foot is split up the quarter, she said. How long's he been off, he said, since haying, maybe. He said he'd meant to take him into the smith at the siding. But the smith had moved to Pincher Creek and the new one charged too dear. And somewhere in the middle of explaining, he heard himself making excuses and stopped, which she also noted. A man who could hear his own excuses still had something left in him. I'll look at it tomorrow in the light, she said. He'll be lame inside a month if you leave it. He nodded and didn't thank her, and that was correct. You didn't thank somebody for a thing they hadn't done yet. That first night she cooked because the food was there and going to waste. And a person who can cook and won't is a kind of liar she didn't want to be. She found flour weevilled at the bottom of the barrel and good above it, and salt pork, and beans that someone had started to soak weeks ago and let go gray and sour, so she threw those out and started a fresh pot, knowing full well they wouldn't be ready till tomorrow, because beans took hours, and there was no hurrying them. She made bannock instead, the way her mother had, hot in the pan with the bacon fat, and she fried the pork, and she made tea strong enough to stand a spoon in. He ate like a man who had forgotten that food could be a thing you looked forward to rather than a chore you got through. Halfway through, he set the fork down and looked at the table edge, and she saw his throat work, and she understood that she had done something to him by accident, that a hot meal made by a woman's hands in this house had a freight to it she hadn't intended. She did not say anything. She got up and refilled his cup, and she set her hand for one moment on his good shoulder, just set it there and took it away, the way you'd steady a young horse that had spooked at its own shadow. Then she sat back down and ate her own supper as if nothing had passed between them, because nothing had, not in words, and words were the thing this house had run out of. She slept in the unfinished addition that night, with a quilt over the window hole and her case as a pillow, the Chinook coming through warm and strange, dripping the eaves all night. And she lay listening to the country and thinking that she had agreed to occupy a grief without ever having seen its shape. In the morning, she saw it whole. The light came up gray and then gold over the long grass, and she walked the place before he was up. She had always trusted what she found before a man could explain it to her. The barn door hung on one hinge, and inside the stalls were clean, which surprised her. A man who let his fences rot but mucked his stalls was a man whose despair had a careful edge, who had given up on the future but not yet on the animals in front of him that very morning. There was a milk cow, dry now, who should have been bred back and hadn't been. There was a stack of hay too small for the herd and the winter coming. There was a plow with a cracked beam leaned against the wall where a man had set it down, meaning to mend it and never had. And there was the well, and the well was the thing that decided her about him. The well had a good cribbing, knew within a few years, the work square and true, the rope sound, the bucket sound. Someone in this place had built one thing right and recently and built it to last. You did not build a well like that if you meant to leave. You built a well like that for children you expected to draw from it. She stood at the well a long while in the cold gold morning, and understood that whatever had happened here had happened to a man who had been planning a whole life and had it taken out from under him between one season and the next. She went up the rise to the two markers because now she wanted to know, and she read them the way she read everything, by what was there and what wasn't. The older one was a name and two dates 40 years apart and the word father. The newer one she stood in front of for a long time. It was a name and one date, and below it, carved small and uneven, by a hand that had been shaking or unpracticed or both, the single word brother. So, she had assumed a wife. She was glad, in a low private way she didn't examine, that she'd been wrong, and then she was ashamed of being glad. And then she put both of those away because they weren't useful and walked back down to start the day. She found him at the barn already, trying to get a halter on the bay one-handed, and she took it from him without a word and had it buckled before the horse had finished objecting. "Your shoulder," she said. "What happened to it?" He didn't answer for long enough that she thought he wouldn't. Then he said the addition. He said the south wall of the addition. Last summer a beam came down wrong. He said it in the flat voice men used for the smaller of two wounds, and she understood that the beam and the brother were the same story, and that he was offering her the part of it that was safe to hand to a stranger. "You build that addition for him," she said. Not quite a question. "For all of it," he said. "Family." He was coming out from Ontario in the spring. And then, because the morning was quiet and she was busy with the horse's foot and not looking at him, which is the only way some men can say a thing, he told her the rest. How his brother had come early, in March, restless and impatient the way the younger one always was, and how the river ice had been wrong that year, gone soft under a chinook just like the one last night, and how a man crossing where he'd crossed safe 100 times went through, and the cold did the rest before anyone could reach him. How they'd buried him up the rise next to the father he'd barely known. How the beam had come down on his own shoulder a month after that, when he was building the room nobody was coming to live in now, and how he'd half wished it had been worse. She didn't tell him she was sorry. Sorry was a coin everybody handed out, and it bought nothing. She lifted the bay's bad foot into her lap, braced it against her apron, and showed him the split running up the hoof wall. "This," she said, "I can fix. It'll grow out by spring if we keep it trimmed and shod right and the ground stays sound. He'll be sound for seeding." It was, she understood as she said it, the kindest thing she had to offer him. Not condolence. A foot that would heal, a horse that would pull a plow, a spring that was still coming whether he believed in it or not. The first week she worked and she watched and she said little. She fixed what could be fixed in the order a place needed fixing, which was never the order a man's pride wanted. She did the hooves first, all of them, the bay and the cow, and the 2 old workhorses he'd half forgotten in the back pasture. She found the rasp and the nippers in her own case, and she made shoes at a forge she got going in the lean-to. The bellows seized with rust that she freed with bacon grease and patience, and she shod the bay herself while the man held the head and learned, without being told he was learning, how it was done. She mended the wire gate with wire, having found a coil of it rusting in the loft where he'd forgotten he'd bought it, which told her his trouble wasn't poverty but the particular paralysis of grief, where a man can own the very thing he needs and not be able to make his hands go and get it. She didn't say that to him. She just used the wire. She bred the cow back to a neighbor's bull, a tall, quiet half-Hereford 4 miles east belonging to a Métis family named Ducharme, and she did it on a handshake and the promise of help at their branding. And when she came home and told him she'd made the arrangement, he looked at her with something that wasn't quite alarm. "You went to Ducharme's," he said. "I did." He said people around here didn't much. Said it carefully, watching her. "People around here," she said, "are going to find their cattle a deal poorer than the Ducharmes come spring, and I expect they'll keep right on not going." She set the kettle on. "That bull is the best within 20 miles, and Émile Ducharme is the only man I've met out here yet who looked me in the eye and didn't price me by my skirt. We'll calve in July. Good calves." He didn't argue. She had noticed he didn't argue with anything that was plainly true, which was rarer in a man than people credited. The trouble, when it came over the seed. She had been on the place 6 weeks by then, and the Chinooks had come and gone and come again, and the ground was beginning to think about thawing in the south-facing draws, and they sat at the plank table one evening, with the seed grain between them, in a sack she'd weighed and graded by hand. He wanted to seed the home quarter to wheat, the same red vife his father had grown, the same his brother had been coming out to grow, all of it, fence to fence, because that was the plan, the old plan, the one the well had been dug for. She could hear how much he needed it to be the plan. She could see his brother in it, and his father, and every spring he hadn't been able to face. She told him no. She told him the home quarter had been cropped to wheat without rest for years before he ever inherited it, that the soil was tired, that she dug it in 4 places and it crumbled wrong in her hand, too fine, the life gone gray out of it the way it goes when you take and take. She told him half of it should go to oats and the low slough margin to nothing at all but rest and grass, and that he should run more cattle and less plow, because the grass out here was the one crop the country grew willingly, and the wheat was a thing you forced from it at a cost that came due eventually. He stood up from the table. It was the closest she'd seen him come to anger, and it wasn't really anger. It was grief wearing anger's coat. He said the wheat was what his father grew. He said it was what his brother died coming out to grow. He said he hadn't hired her to come change the only plan he had left of them. She let him say it. She let the words go out of him into the room, and she watched him hear them land, and she watched him understand, the way she'd watched him understand his own excuses that first day, that he had just told a stranger his real reason, and his real reason had nothing to do with wheat. "I'm not asking you to bury them again," she said when he'd gone quiet. "I'm asking you to grow something that'll come up. Wheat on that ground this year breaks your heart in August. I've seen the ground. I've put my hands in it. You can plant what they planted and watch it fail, and call that keeping faith. Or you can grow what the land will carry and feed yourself through the winter and have seed for next year. One of those honors them. The other just keeps you company in the dark." He sat back down. He looked at the seed grain a long time. Then he asked, in a different voice, what she'd plant the South 42. She told him. He listened. They settled it between them at the table, with the lamp guttering, the way she imagined the well had been settled, two people deciding to build for a season they intended to be alive to see. Spring came hard and then beautiful, the way it does up there. The slough filled with snow water, and the frogs started, and the geese came over in long ragged skeins headed north, and the ground opened and they seeded. Oats on the tired home quarter, a careful patch of the red fife on the rested South 40 where it had a chance the slough margin left to grass. She drove one team and he drove the other, working his shoulder back to use a little more each day, and she said nothing about it, but noticed when he could lift the harness clear without the catch in his breath, and noted the morning he did it without thinking, which is how you know a thing has truly healed, when the body forgets it was ever broken. The bay's foot grew out sound by seeding, just as she'd said. She finished the addition that summer. Not for any family coming from Ontario. She finished it because an unfinished room in a house is a wound that won't scar, a thing the eye snags on every single day, and she had learned that you cannot ask a man to heal inside a house that is itself still bleeding. She framed it, and she got glass for the window from the new town that had grown up around the elevator. And she put a real floor in, and when it was done it was just a room, a good, dry room. And the thing it had been a monument to stopped being able to ambush him every time he came round the south side of the house. He stood in the doorway of it the day she finished, and didn't say anything for a while. "My brother was going to sleep here," he said, finally. "I know. It's a good room." "It is," she said. "Somebody should sleep in it." She meant it plainly, the way she meant everything, but she watched it reach him and turn over in him and become more than she'd meant. And she let it, because by then she'd stopped pretending to herself that she didn't care which way it landed. They calved in July, and the Ducharme bull threw good calves, big and quick to their feet, and she and the man hauled water to the Ducharme's branding in payment of her handshake and worked alongside them in the dust and the bawling and the smell of singed hair. And on the ride home in the long northern dusk that doesn't quite go dark in July, he said he supposed people would talk about that too, her going to brand at the Ducharmes. "Let them," she said. "Talk's the cheapest crop on the prairie. Everybody grows it and nobody can sell it." He laughed. It surprised them both. It came out of him rusty, like the bellows she'd freed, like a thing that hadn't been used in so long it had half forgotten its own shape, and she heard in it the man he'd been before the river ice. And she thought, there, that's who built the well. The oats came up thick and gold, and the careful wheat made a fair crop on the rested ground, enough for seed and bread, and a little to sell. And the grass on the slough margin she'd spared came back so heavy that fall that they cut hay off it twice and went into winter with the stack the right size for once. The first hard storm of that winter, a 3-day blizzard out of the north that buried the fences, they spent in the house with the stove ticking and the dog under the table, and the wind doing its worst against the new dry walls of the addition. And they were warm, and they were fed, and the stock was sheltered, and nobody was alone in it. She caught him looking at her across the lamp once and looking away, and she went on darning the sock in her lap. And she let the question sit in the room unasked because some questions answer themselves better if you don't crowd them. He asked it anyway, eventually. He was a careful man but not a coward, and the difference matters. He asked how long she thought she'd want to stay. She heard everything that was folded inside it. It wasn't a man trying to keep a good hired hand. It was a man who had already lost everyone who'd ever told him they were staying, asking the only question he had left, and bracing for the answer that had always come before. She set the darning down. She looked at the window, where the storm was scouring the glass she'd hauled out from town, and set in the frame herself. Outside, the cold was the kind that kills the careless. But in here, the stove ticked, and the kettle steamed, and the dog sighed in its sleep. She said she thought she'd want to stay long enough to see whether the South 40 would take wheat again next year. Now that it had rested, he went still. She said that would be at least through next harvest, maybe the one after. He looked at the fire instead of at her, the way he did when a thing was too large to look at directly. She had not meant it as more than the truth, which was all she ever offered anybody, but she understood, watching him hold it, that he'd heard it as the thing it also was. A man could say he was staying. Anybody could say it. What told you the truth was whether they were there in March when the river ice went wrong, there in August when the wheat failed or didn't, there through the accumulated ordinary days when nobody was watching and there was no glory in it. Only the work and the weather and the slow particular trust that builds between two people who have seen each other not quit. She picked the darning back up. There didn't seem to be anything else that needed saying, so she didn't say it. The South 40 took wheat again the next year. Better than the first, the way rested ground will. She didn't say she'd told him so. She never did. By the third harvest, there was no more talk of how long she meant to stay, because the question had stopped being a question and become the shape of their days, answered every morning by the fact of both of them rising in the dark to the same work. The way real questions out there always got answered, not in words, but in the going on. There was a marriage in there somewhere, a quiet one, the Methodist circuit rider, doing it at the kitchen table, with the Ducharmes standing up for them, and a meal after. But she never made much of the date, and neither did he. It seemed to both of them a small formal acknowledgement of a thing that had already been decided long before, the way the well had decided it, the way the finished room had, the way every fence they mended together had quietly settled it one post at a time. Years on, and they were years, good ones and a few terrible ones, a hailstorm that flattened a whole crop in 20 minutes, a winter that took half the herd, a daughter and then a son who learned to draw water from the well that had been dug for them before anyone knew their names. A man came through on the new road south, a young fellow on a tired horse, and stopped at the gate to ask if he could water his animal. He looked at the place while the horse drank, a good house with a sound south room, a barn with both its hinges, fences true to the eye, fat cattle on grass that had been let rest in its turn, a windbreak of poplar somebody had planted young and let grow, the kind of place that looked, to a stranger passing, as though it had always been prosperous, as though nothing had ever gone wrong here at all. A woman was out along the fence line, gray coming into her hair now, setting staples with an economy of motion the young man noticed without quite knowing why. Not a stroke wasted, the hammer falling exactly where she meant it and nowhere else. He asked the old man at the gate who owned the place. The old man looked across the yard at her a while before he answered, the way you look at something you have looked at every day for 30 years and still haven't finished seeing. He said she'd come off the train one October when the place was about done for, and that she'd looked at his lame horse before she'd looked at him, and that she'd stayed. The young man watched her work a moment longer. He asked if she'd always been like that. The old man said he expected she had.